Despite there being more than 50 Macross games released over the last 4 decades, none of them have made their way to the United States. That is, until now. Coming 43 years after Super Dimension Fortress Macross first debuted in Japan, gamers from around the world now have an opportunity to play Macross Shooting Inside, an old-school shoot-'em-up that has you fighting enemies with both a horizontal and a vertical perspective. Now, that's a cool gimmick, but the question still remains. Will this be the game that introduces a whole new audience to the wonderful world of Macross? Well, that's what we're about to find out when I review Macross Shooting Inside. It's probably worth mentioning right up front that I don't have a whole lot of experience with Macross, either as an anime or as a game series. You see, like a lot of people my age, I'm more familiar with the Americanized version, Robotech. But outside of that, I have a very rudimentary knowledge of Macross. Thankfully, I'm a quick study, and I don't even mind getting dropped into the middle of a story and needing to catch up, especially if the shoot-'em-up gameplay is a lot of fun. And look, I'm not alone here, as I suspect that there are going to be a lot of gamers who are actually introduced to the science fiction story of Macross through this game. The good news is that once I heard that Shooting Inside involved a mysterious woman trying to harness the hidden power of music, and both pilots and songstresses are finding themselves transported through time and space, I gotta admit, I was intrigued. I may not know who these characters are or how any of this works, but I love shooting down spaceships and mechs and, well, pretty much anything else that gets in my way. I say, bring on the epic space battles. Now, when I talk about the narrative, I'm actually talking about several different stories that follow each of the famous pilots from the anime. You see, the game attempts this trick where it brings a bunch of fan-favorite heroes from different Macross series together to interact with one another and solve a very video-gamey problem. I'm sure that fans of the show will be enthralled by seeing one character interact with somebody from a completely different part of the timeline, but honestly, I found these intertwining stories to be dreadfully dull. But we'll get more into that in a little bit. Look, if you've played a space shoot-'em-up before, then you're going to have no problem getting into Macross. This is a fairly straightforward action game where we use one button to shoot and another one to roll away from the enemy fire. Really, the most interesting gameplay element here is a radar that you control with your right analog stick that allow our pilot to target enemies and then shoot homing missiles at them. And watch out, because if things get really bad, you can always press a button to call in a support strike that'll take away most of the enemy fire and then just rip right through the bad guys' ships. That's pretty cool, but it is still pretty standard stuff. Now what you're going to find is that instead of picking up different weapons mid-level like most shoot-'em-ups, we end up getting stuck with whatever weapon is assigned to the ship that you're piloting. Each of the different characters have their own transforming ship, so you'll select between a spread shot, a laser attack, sustained fire, and more. You'll upgrade the effectiveness of this attack by picking up the floating items and filling up the power gauge, though the weapons don't visually change all that much when they get stronger. It's also worth mentioning that each of the ships have different stats, making some stronger, or faster, or more able to roll away from enemy fire. If you've heard anything about Shooting Inside, it's probably that the game is both a horizontal and a vertical shooter. The marketing of this game was quick to make it sound like Macross offers the best of both worlds, where the perspective is sometimes side-scrolling and sometimes overhead. Of course, if you're a longtime fan of shooters, then you'll likely already know that this is far from the first game to do something like this. I mean, Konami's critically acclaimed action game Axlay switched between the two perspectives all the way back in 1992, and there have been plenty of recent shooters that have made the switch on the fly, similar to Macross. Now, to be fair to Shooting Inside, the camera does occasionally switch to a behind-the-ship view that reminds me a little bit of Star Fox. There are also overhead bits that turn the game into a dual-stick shooter, allowing you to quickly shoot at enemies all around you, no matter where they're coming from. Honestly, I generally like variety like this, but these two sections feel more like undercooked minigames when compared to the usual vertical and horizontal bits. That's not to say that the traditional shoot-'em-up stages are all that great either. because Macross is definitely not one of the genre's top tier titles. Don't get me wrong, there's fun to be had here, but there's just nothing that's gonna wow you. I hate to say it, but that includes the surprisingly limp boss fights, which neither look cool nor put up much of a fight. These not only pale in comparison to recent shooters like Signy, All Guns Blazing, but they also don't compare to the old school action games from the early 1990s. None of these bosses are as memorable as even the worst baddies in Gyara's or Thunder Force 3. And since we're already comparing Macross to the old school greats, I want to take this moment to mention that the backgrounds are just as bland as the gameplay. Half of the stages feel like they're happening in front of the same boring old chunk of space. And even when you finally fly through a cave or get close to a planet, the backgrounds just aren't that impressive. The graphics and stages lack any kind of style, and I wouldn't even know that the game was connected to a popular anime if not for the cinemas. Look, maybe it's because of the anime roots, but Macross is extremely chatty. The story mode has lengthy conversations before each level, after each level, and even right before you battle one of the many underwhelming bosses. What's really frustrating is that these conversations will bleed right into the gameplay bits, where the players are focusing on shooting down bad guys. Look, in theory, there's nothing wrong with a little mid-level chatter. That kind of thing has been done effectively in plenty of other action games. The problem is that, much like everything else in this game, all the conversations are in Japanese. That means that unless you understand the language, you're probably going to have to read the tiny subtitles hidden away at the bottom right of the screen. In other words, to keep up with the story, you're going to need to split your attention between dodging bullet hell patterns and reading subtitles. That's a terrible combination. Of course, the real flaw here is that the game does a bad job of introducing a new audience to the world of Macross. Look, I may not be an expert when it comes to the anime, but I know enough to know that the original story is a lot more compelling than what's presented here. There's a real level of importance and urgency that's just missing in this game. And what makes it worse is that you never really get to know these characters, despite what feels like non-stop chatter. Honestly, there's no reason why Macross can't break into the mainstream outside of Japan. But let me tell you, it's gonna require a better game than Shooting Insight to make that happen. As the first Macross game to come out in the United States, Shooting Insight is a big disappointment. Instead of pulling us in and getting new players invested in the compelling story, the game seems more interested in spinning its wheels with pointless conversations that won't make a lick of sense to anybody who isn't already familiar with the anime. And all of this is before you discover how bland and forgettable the gameplay is. Between the terrible boss fights and the boring backgrounds, there just isn't a whole lot to keep people going. Couple all that with the $40 asking price, and Macross Shooting Insight is a tough game to recommend, even to the most hardcore shoot-'em-up fans. Hey, thanks for watching my review. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new reviews and features almost every day. Now, here's the question I have for you. Do you think that Macross can make it big in the United States? Should they try again? Maybe with a different genre or story or something? Let me see your thoughts in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back later this week with a new Review Crew episode looking at the Accolade Sports Collection. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.